The oath was fresh on her lips. The words, solemn and binding, echoed in her mind as she stood before the nation. She had practiced them countless times, but nothing could prepare her for the weight they carried now. The cheers of the crowd still echoed in her ears. The jubilant faces, the waving flags, the sense of unity and hope that had filled the air just hours ago seemed like a distant memory. President Thompson, sworn in just hours ago, stood at the window of the Oval Office. The room, steeped in history, felt both grand and suffocating. She gazed out, her mind racing with the enormity of her new responsibilities. A new era of hope, they had said, a fresh start, the dawn of a brighter future for all Americans. But as the sun rose, so did the shadows of uncertainty and fear. But the world outside told a different story. Dark clouds loomed on the horizon, casting a pall over the city. The streets, once bustling with life, now seemed eerily quiet. A red phone, stark and ominous, pulsed on her desk. Its shrill ring cut through the silence, a harbinger of the chaos to come. It hadn't stopped ringing since the first frantic call. Each ring brought more dire news, more urgent pleas for action. A general's voice, strained with urgency, painted a chilling picture. The situation was dire, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Enemy ICBMs launched from unknown silos were hurtling towards American soil. The unthinkable was happening. On her first day, the nightmare scenario that every president dreads was now her reality. Her stomach clenched, but there was no time for fear. She had to act, and she had to act now. The weight of her decisions would be felt by millions, the weight of 330 million souls pressed down on her, each one looking to her for guidance, for leadership, for hope in this darkest hour. The continuity of government protocols, rehearsed but never truly imagined, kicked into gear. This was no drill. Every move, every decision had to be precise and calculated. This was a nightmare unfolding in real time. The world watched, holding its breath as President Thompson faced the ultimate test of her leadership. The war room buzzed with tension. Screens flickered with data, painting a terrifying tapestry of the attack. Enemy missiles, dozens of them, were skipping across the upper atmosphere. Their targets, the beating heart of America, Washington, D.C., the nerve center, New York City, the financial hub, Los Angeles, a sprawling symbol of American culture, military bases, missile silos, airfields, all marked for destruction. Each blip on the screen represented not just a weapon, but countless lives. Families going about their day, children playing in parks, all oblivious to the fiery apocalypse hurtling towards them. The clock ticked down with agonizing slowness. Each second brought the inevitable closer. Hope, however slim, rested with the nation's missile defense system, a network of satellites, radars and interceptors all poised to shoot down the incoming threat. But even the most advanced technology had its limits. The president listened, her face grim as an engineer explained the system's capabilities. A 55% success rate in ideal conditions. But this was far from ideal. Enemy jamming was disrupting the network, blinding their sensors. The president pressed, her voice betraying her growing fear. What did 55% really mean? How many missiles would get through? The answer, evasive but honest, chilled her to the bone. Dozens of enemy warheads could potentially breach their defenses, enough to cripple the nation. America was not defenseless. Deep beneath the waves, aboard submarines patrolling the world's oceans, lay the ultimate deterrent Trident II nuclear missiles. Each one capable of unleashing unimaginable fury. The president now held the fate of the world in her hands. Retaliate and unleash a global cataclysm. A tit-for-tat exchange that would leave no winners, only ashes and despair. But what about the people? Her people? Could she condemn millions more to a fiery death in the name of vengeance? Was there another way? The clock ticked on, each second an eternity. The red phone, a constant reminder of the impossible choice she had to make. The scientists painted a bleak picture. The immediate blast from a single nuclear detonation would vaporize everything within a several-mile radius. Buildings would crumble, streets would melt, and human beings would simply cease to exist. But the horror wouldn't end there. Fires would rage, consuming everything in their path. Millions would die from burns, radiation sickness, and the collapse of infrastructure. And then, the long, slow death. Radioactive fallout carried by the wind would blanket vast swathes of the planet. Crops would wither, water would be poisoned, and the sun would be blotted out by a perpetual nuclear winter. The few survivors, haunted by radiation sickness and genetic mutations, would envy the dead. The weight of the situation pressed down on President Thompson. She stood alone, the vast expanse of the White House grounds stretching out before her, a silent witness to her turmoil. The night was still, but her mind was anything but. Every decision, every possible outcome played out in her thoughts, each more daunting than the last. The enormity of the decision, the sheer scale of potential destruction, threatened to crush her. The city below, usually bustling with life, now seemed eerily quiet, as if holding its breath in anticipation. The weight of responsibility was almost unbearable, a heavy cloak that she could not shrug off. Her hand trembled as she reached for a glass of water, the ice clinking a stark counterpoint to the hushed tension of the room. The coolness of the glass was a small comfort, a brief respite from the storm raging within her. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the enormity of the task ahead loomed large. The generals, their faces etched with grim determination, awaited her orders. They had been through countless battles, faced innumerable challenges, but this was different. This was a decision that could change the course of history, and they knew it. Their eyes, filled with a mix of fear and resolve, were fixed on her, waiting for her command. Their eyes, hardened by years of service, held a terrifying mix of fear and resolve. They were ready to act, to follow her lead, but the uncertainty of the situation weighed heavily on them. Each one of them understood the gravity of the moment, the potential consequences of their actions. They were ready to carry out her command, whatever it may be, but she was alone, utterly alone. The solitude of leadership was never more apparent than in moments like this. She felt the isolation keenly, the burden of making a decision that no one else could make. This was not a decision that could be shared, delegated, or rationalized away. It was hers and hers alone. The weight of the world, quite literally, rested on her shoulders. She looked out over the vast landscape, the horizon stretching endlessly before her, a reminder of the enormity of her responsibility. The fate of the world, quite literally, rested on her shoulders. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the decision ahead. The night was silent, but the weight of the world was deafening. She knew that whatever choice she made, it would echo through history, shaping the future in ways she could scarcely imagine. History, the president knew, was littered with near misses, times when the world stood on the brink of nuclear annihilation, only to be pulled back at the last moment by sheer luck or the courage of individuals. The Cuban Missile Crisis, a stark reminder of how close they had come. A Soviet submarine officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refusing to fire his nuclear torpedo. A single man's decision averting global catastrophe. Then there were the accidents, the false alarms, the miscalculations, the technical glitches that could have, at any moment, spiraled into Armageddon. A chilling reminder that human fallibility was an ever-present danger in a world armed with nuclear weapons. The true horror of nuclear war, the president realized, extended far beyond the immediate destruction. It was the slow, insidious death of the planet, the poisoning of the air, water, and soil, the collapse of civilization as we knew it. What would happen to the survivors? To the children born into a world shrouded in radioactive dust? Would they inherit a wasteland, haunted by the ghosts of billions? What kind of future would they face? These were not just abstract questions. They were the very real, very human consequences of a nuclear exchange, consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield, far beyond national borders, and far into the future. The red phone continued to pulse, a constant reminder of the nightmare unfolding. Its rhythmic glow was a stark contrast to the stillness of the room, a silent alarm that something was terribly wrong. The air was thick with tension, each pulse echoing the urgency of the situation. It was a call that could not be ignored, a beacon in the darkness demanding attention. But as President Thompson stared out at the world, a world teetering on the brink, a different kind of urgency took hold. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on his shoulders. He could see the fragility of peace, the thin line separating order from chaos. The dusk outside mirrored the twilight of global stability, a delicate balance that could tip at any moment. This was not the time for despair. Despair was a luxury they could not afford. It was a time for resolve, for determination. The faces of those who believed in a better future flashed in his mind, fueling his resolve. He knew that giving up was not an option. The stakes were too high, the consequences too dire. It was a time for action. Every second counted. The urgency in his movements reflected the urgency of the situation. There was no room for hesitation, no time for second-guessing. The path forward was clear, and it required bold, decisive action. A time to break the silence and shine a light on the existential threat of nuclear weapons. The voices of the people outside demanding change were a powerful reminder of what was at stake. Their signs, their chants were a call to action, a plea for a safer world. The message was clear, the time for complacency was over. The world needed to wake up. The slumber of ignorance and indifference had lasted too long. It was time for a collective awakening, a realization of the dangers that loomed. People needed to rise, to stand up and be counted. The future depended on their awareness and their willingness to act. People needed to understand the stakes. The headlines screamed of the impending doom. The news broadcasts painted a grim picture. But understanding was the first step towards change. Knowledge was power, and it was crucial that everyone grasped the gravity of the situation. The threat was real, and it required a unified response. The consequences of inaction were simply too great. This wasn't about politics, it wasn't about ideology, it was about survival. The discussions in boardrooms and town halls echoed the same sentiment, the need for immediate, concerted action. The survival of humanity was at stake, transcending all other differences. This was a call to action, a call that transcended borders and backgrounds. It was a call for unity, for solidarity in the face of a common threat. The voices at the rallies, the speeches from the podiums, all carried the same message. We must act, and we must act now. A call to engage in dialogue, to demand accountability, and to work towards a future free from the threat of nuclear annihilation. The conversations in parks, the petitions being signed were all steps towards a larger goal. It was about building a movement, creating a groundswell of support for a safer, more secure world. The time for silence was over. The time for passive acceptance had passed. It was a moment for voices to be heard, for actions to be taken. The speeches, the slogans were all part of a larger chorus demanding change. The time for action was now. The marchers, the hand-holders, were symbols of a united front. Together, they represented the hope and determination of a world ready to fight for its future. The call to light had been made, and the response was clear. The time to act was now.